Welcome to the panel on Imprisoning Schindler, responding to the legal vulnerability of those who aid refugees. And our thanks to the World Justice Project for sponsoring this panel. My name is Kate Jastrom of the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies at the University of California, Hastings College of the Law. I'm in San Francisco, which I am grateful to say is a sanctuary city in a sanctuary state. I'm also the outgoing co-chair of the International Refugee Law Interest Group, and I invite you to our business meeting tomorrow, Friday, at 2:15 Washington, D.C. time. But today, I'm very excited to moderate such an amazing panel of experts on such an important topic. As some governments, including this one, are taking ever more draconian steps to prevent access to territory and turn away asylum seekers who have managed to present themselves at the border, lawyers have pointed to Article 31 of the Refugee Convention, which disallows penalizing refugees for their illegal entry or presence. Not with great success, I might add, but we at least have that treaty provision. However, people who want to help refugees for reasons of conscience or simple humanity and solidarity find that they themselves are in legal peril, or maybe. And Article 31 does not speak to those helpers. So what other sources of law might be brought to bear in defending humanitarians and protecting them from criminal sanctions? What's actually happening on the ground? Our experts will help us explore these questions. So we'll proceed as follows. I'll introduce all three panelists at the beginning. Then each one will speak for about 10 minutes, as we want to provide plenty of time toward the end for questions, which I ask you to put in the Q&A box, not the chat box. After the presentations, we'll take the questions. So allow me to introduce our experts. We'll hear first from Obiora Okafor, who's the UN Independent Expert on Human Rights and International Solidarity, and a former chair of the UN Human Rights Council Advisory Committee. He's professor of law and York Research Chair in International and Transnational Legal Studies at the Osgoode Hall Law School at York University in Toronto. We'll then hear from Frances Weber, who specialized in human rights and refugee law at the English Bar until her retirement and co-edited the leading immigration law textbook. She's an honorary vice president of the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers. Since her retirement, she's worked extensively on issues of racism and immigration at the Institute of Race Relations in London, where she is vice chair. She has written Borderline Justice, The Fight for Refugee and Migrant Rights, several book chapters and reports, and many journal articles. Most recently, The Trend Towards Criminalizing Humanitarian Action for the Journal of Immigration, Asylum, and Nationality Law. And that was based on a report for the court in the ERCI case in Lesbos, Greece. And then lastly, we'll hear from Greg Kirkendall, who is a criminal defense lawyer based in Tucson, Arizona. Greg is the director of the Mexican Capital Legal Assistance Program, serving as the Mexican Foreign Ministry's principal lawyer in cases of Mexican nationals charged with death penalty crimes. For the last 2 years, Greg successfully represented Dr. Scott Warren, a humanitarian aid worker whom the US government prosecuted through 3 separate trials until Greg ultimately obtained acquittal for him on all charges. So welcome to all 3 of my wonderful panelists, and thank you for taking the time to share your knowledge and experience with us. So Obi, if you could please start us off.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thanks for sharing. Thanks to all who did so much work to put this together. Particularly happy to share the stage with 2 renowned practitioners who've actually done real work in, defending those who the state, many states have tried to persecute, in my view, for coming in aid of refugees, asylum seekers, and so on. Their work greatly aided the work that I have been doing for the UN and also as an academic. So I'm gonna, because of the shortness of time, I don't have time to sort of flesh out everything I put. I should say that what I'm gonna speak about is based on a report that I presented to the Human Rights Council in 2018. The UN Human Rights Council. I'll focus just on the international law arguments. So on the one hand, I'm going to make it quick. It's going to be quite quick, not fully fleshed out, but we can have a conversation on general international law, and more specific, the second sort of segment would be on international human rights law. Again, just to give a couple of examples, and I think a link to the report itself will be shared, so you can get it. Even the report itself, it's a summary because you're bound by UN custom to 10,000 words, but at least it gives a fuller picture. So as Kate has already said, the international refugee law in itself is not explicit enough. It's not clear enough in protecting those who come in aid or show solidarity to refugees or asylum seekers. But that does not mean, in my view, I argue in this UN report, that there is no protection for them at all from other, if you like, sub-bodies of international law. So under general international law, and this is well known, Frances, other people have written about it, there is a very long-standing duty in general international law under the law of the sea to actually rescue people, including, of course, asylum seekers and refugees, who I have to emphasize are people because sometimes governments don't treat them that way, human beings, everyone who is in distress. It's not just that you can rescue them lawfully. There is actually a duty on the captains of vessels and, quote, responsible authorities, anyone responsible, to actually come in aid. So it's a very sort of strong international law obligation. I don't have time to reel through. There are about 3 or 4 other treaties, but more lately, Article 98 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea imposes this duty on responsible persons, ship captains, and so on, excuse me, to come in aid of refugees. So the argument I make, just to cut it short, because I know I don't have too much time, is that if there is a duty imposed on someone to do something, you cannot then criminalize them for doing it. It's a very simple argument. It's an argument that has been successful quite a bit in the courts of the sort of the coastal states and along the Mediterranean, in Italy especially. So there's the Capanamo, Mota, Heidi cases, and a number of cases. But the point is that it takes years sometimes and a lot of expense for the those who show solidarity to these asylum seekers and refugees to defend themselves, even if they succeed in the end. There is still a harm that comes to them, the harm of mental anguish, of having to spend money and time, valuable time, defending themselves in these courts for long periods. So that's, excuse me, my first argument. This duty is a binding international obligation on at least 167 states. I checked yesterday, and maybe there was another state that ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea yesterday, I don't know, or today, but it's 167 states have this obligation. So you might then say, what about the other states? Well, there's other treaties, much older treaties dating back to 1974, that some of these other states may have ratified as well, that could impose this duty. However, of course, this is a limited obligation, only applies to the sea, right? To bodies of water. It doesn't apply to land territories, which is an important point. If I have time, I'll return to. Excuse me. Now, but an important entailed point is, so having rescued asylum seekers or refugees in distress at sea, is there then a right to disembark them at the nearest safe port, right? A lot of the coastal states along the Mediterranean say no. I say yes. I argue that there is an implied duty on those states to accept those vessels. I also argue that by virtue of the acquittal of those charged in the Murtada case, Kapanemo, and the Morrison case, I forget the name of the ship captain. I don't know if actually that one has been acquitted, but anyway, there have been many acquittals of those who disembarked. That there is at least an implied obligation on the coastal states to allow their disembarkation. It would evacuate that duty of much meaning if ship captains had a duty imposed on them. Remember, they're going along on their way and they see people who are drowning and they pick them up, or even if it's their intention to pick them up and you say, oh, they can't disembark them anywhere. That would not make much sense in my view. So I still have to emphasize, this still leaves us with land territory, right? This is all about those who are in distress at sea, but there's a lot of persons who show solidarity on land. So there's many cases along the U.S.-Mexican border, one of which, I think one of which Greg has handled. There's many prominent cases from France and other places about those who show solidarity on land. And I'll quickly, and our time is running down, just make the argument. The first is that states often take refuge in the I call it the anti-smuggling protocol. My argument actually is that that protocol explicitly saves the international human rights of everyone, including, I must emphasize, asylum seekers and refugees. It's explicit in Article 19 of the anti-smuggling protocol to save it. But even if you were to read that protocol as not saving the right, then you can go to other bodies of international law. For example, that's international human rights law. If you look at the right to life, for instance, and take the same example of a person drowning at sea, they have a right to life under international human rights law. To then come to their aid, in other words, to help them or aid them in the enjoyment of the right to life cannot be criminal, right? If they have a right to life, it cannot be criminal. My point then is that to then make a law criminalizing or suppressing those who aid the enjoyment of the right to life itself cannot normally be legal in international law. Sometimes lawyers like Frances and Greg are targeted by states when they come to aid of persons who show solidarity to asylum seekers, especially if they're undocumented. Article 14 of the ICCPR grants clearly a right to fair trial. And if you target a lawyer who is, again, aiding the enjoyment of this right, it clearly contravenes or ought to contravene international human rights law. I also give an example about, I think Greg's client took in some asylum seekers, refugees, and gave them food and so on, allow them stay in his house. If you look at Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which I don't think the US is a party to, but most states, 170-something states are parties to this treaty. Again, they have entitled under international law because the language is everyone. There's no exception. Everyone's entitled to the right to food, water, and so on. And for the state to criminalize those who aid the enjoyment of these rights would, in my view, violate international human rights law. There are more technical, complicated arguments I could get into around progressive realization, language, and all that, but I don't have time. So let me leave it at that, just to give you that teaser, and hopefully we'll have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Obi. That was cruel to only give each of you 10 minutes, but it was a great introduction for us. Frances, could we please hear from you now?
Thanks. I will try to match Obi in both learning and speed, but it's going to be very difficult. Okay, thanks for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here, albeit virtually. So Hannah Arendt pointed out that universal human rights are dependent on effective nationality and are useless without vigorous protection. So that's what we're about, hopefully, all of us, is the vigorous protection of the rights of those who are the least able to exercise their human rights. So I was going to run through quickly 4 questions, but I may not have time. What kinds of solidarity actions are being criminalized? And I'm talking here, my reference point is obviously the UK and Europe. What laws are being used against humanitarians and solidarity activists? What bodies of law are available to counter this criminalization, and do they work? Now, Obi has dealt with some of those questions, thank goodness, so I will be able to be quicker. I should just mention that I've been involved in writing 2 reports for the Institute of Race Relations, which go into detail on these, not on international law side, but on why these solidarity actions are necessary, why people are being criminalized, who is being criminalized, and so on. And those reports hopefully will come up in a link, which you can then access for free. They're called Humanitarianism, the Unacceptable Face of Solidarity. That's 2017. And an update, When Witnesses Won't Be Silenced, in April 2019. Okay, so the sorts of actions, obviously, that are being criminalized. Sea rescue we've had, which is very important in the Mediterranean and Europe, because the EU and member states have tried so many different ways to stop people rescuing migrants, boats in distress. So first response for migrants and refugees as they land has been criminalized. Notifying the Coast Guard of migrant boats in distress has been criminalized. Land rescue, which in the European context tends to be more in terms of ski patrols, rescuing people from very dangerous mountain passes between, say, Italy and France. Lifts across international borders. Then there's a section of activities, provision of the essentials of life, food, water, shelter, at the sort of border bottlenecks, because obviously in response to the refugee humanitarian crisis, the EU has closed its internal borders, a lot of them, and so you've got all these border bottlenecks, Calais, Ventimiglia, and so on, where there is no provision. It's a hostile environment deliberately created by member states and the EU, and people trying to provide food and shelter and water have found themselves criminalized. And also, of course, protests and action to stop deportations. So the laws that are used against them are many and various. The main one, obviously, is smuggling. The Facilitation Directive, EU 2002, which reflects national laws in the EU member states, requires member states to criminalize intentional assistance for material gain of unlawful stay and intentional assistance of entry or transit with no requirement for material gain, although member states may exempt humanitarian smuggling from criminalization. Many people, including the European Commission, are under the impression that the EU, that the UK has used this humanitarian exemption, but that's not the case. Those assisting asylum seekers to enter the UK commit the crime of facilitation of unlawful entry. And a humanitarian motive for that is relevant only to sentencing. Assisting asylum seekers to arrive at a port to present themselves to a border official is not a crime unless it's done for gain. So in that way, the UK is able to say, we do not criminalise those who bring asylum seekers to the UK otherwise than for gain. But actually, if it's humanitarian smuggling, they do. So it's very, very misleading. So other crimes or offences that have been charged, so wrongful registration of a ship as a pleasure boat and then using it for rescue, that was a charge in Malta. Wrong labelling of refugees' discarded clothing as special waste and not toxic waste, that was a charge in Italy. Disobeying official orders, used again in sea rescue cases, where particularly where people are told to hand the refugees that they've rescued over to the Libyan Coast Guard so that they can be taken back to Libya. People have been charged with disobeying orders. I better speed up, sorry. People have been charged with criminal association, with espionage, with forgery, with money laundering, believe it or not, for doing crowdfunding to assist refugees. Local bylaws have prohibited unauthorised distribution of food. And in the UK, anti-terrorist laws of endangering airport security have been used against those attempting to stop a deportation. So you can't say that the authorities are not inventive in their use of the criminal law. Other measures that are used include arrest without any prosecution. There's a Catholic charity, Secours Catholique, which was working in Calais providing showers, and they were arrested along with the kids who they were giving showers to. Withdrawal of registration of search and rescue ships. So, and banning orders, telling people to leave, to leave their towns. So how do we counter this? Well, Obi has talked about the smuggling protocol, which defines smuggling as an integral part of smuggling as gain or profit. So that's important. The law of the sea, it's important to note that the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, the Maritime Safety Committee, guidelines on the treatment of persons rescued at sea. There's guidelines on the necessity or the duty, if you like, to take those rescued to a place of safety, to a port of safety. And that becomes extremely relevant when we look at what's happening in the sort of triangle of Italy, Malta, and Libya, which hopefully I will have time to go into. So human rights law has been talked about. And I would note here that in Calais, the action of the prefect of Calais in banning the unauthorized distribution of food and water was overturned by the administrative court in Lille with reference to human rights law, the right to freedom from inhuman and degrading treatment. So that's one example where it was very useful. In addition, of course, there's the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health, which is very important, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is also extremely important given the number of refugees who are children. There's also states' obligations to facilitate humanitarian relief to those needing it within their jurisdiction. Humanitarian relief defined in the Nicaragua v. US case. And if you look at the Committee on the Covenant on Political rights, the general comment number 6 on the right to life, you'll see that obligation written in there. There's also a UN General Assembly resolution on that, 46182 of 1991. There are also now some soft law declarations on the rights of human rights defenders. The UN Declaration on the Right and Responsibility of Individuals, Groups and Organs of Society to Promote and Protect Universally Recognized Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, General Assembly Resolution 53144 of 1999. And of course, reports like that Obi did, which are extremely useful if you're doing a case. You can use the soft law, you can use these reports. The UN Special Rapporteur Agnes Callamard, who wrote a report, Saving Lives is Not a Crime, in 2018, reference A/73314. So there is quite a lot of international law out there, hard law on human rights, the law of the sea, soft law on the rights of human rights defenders that needs to be used. Finished. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Frances. And again, thank you for trying to compress your deep knowledge of the law and the situation in Europe into 10 minutes for us.
Okay, well, I didn't manage it. I did 12 minutes, but still.
That's okay. We have time.
Okay.
So, Greg, now I'd like to turn to you to reflect on how you were successfully able to defend your client. I'm sure you can't go into court in Tucson, Arizona and talk about soft law. So how did this actually work?
Well, we did. We went into court a lot and talked about all kind of law. Agnes Callamard did reference the Scott Warren case in the report that Frances just mentioned. And we filed a motion to dismiss on the basis of it being an international law violation. But as everybody in this audience knows, the United States doesn't pay that much attention to international law, especially in a criminal context. So we were unsurprisingly unsuccessful in that respect, trying to use international law. But we did have the support of a whole lot of people and around the world. And I think that while it may not have swayed the judge and the jury didn't even know about it, it certainly made my job easier because I've frankly never had the support of anybody but my client's mother, perhaps, in most of the dealings that I've had in court. So it was really extraordinary to have so much, not just physical presence of people in court supporting us, but also emailing and offering up help. And we had a great deal of assistance from a very large law firm, Perkins Coie, that loaned us their trial consultant, their jury consultant, to help us hone our message for the second trial. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, and if I can, I'm going to back up. I don't normally speak this quickly, but I'm going to try to do it this time. And I'm going to give a little bit of background. The area that we're talking about this occurring is basically half of the border running from California across Arizona, almost to New Mexico, and where it meets the top of northern Mexico. And then there's another section of the United States that is just enormous, and there's virtually nothing there in terms of assistance or help for migrants who are crossing there. And the migrants do cross there because of a policy that has been put into place. I think it was put into place in the Clinton administration, called prevention through deterrence. The idea being that if we make it difficult enough for migrants to migrate, that they'll throw up their hands and go back home. That is, that they'll do some kind of cost-benefit analysis and say to themselves, we're not going to risk going to the United States because of the way that the U.S. government has weaponized the desert and the terribly treacherous environment that they're being funneled into, away from places where they could actually be rescued or find some assistance. So this area of land that we're talking about is out in the only town is Ajo, Arizona. It's a town of about 3,000, and it's mostly at this point a place where border patrolmen live, because the masses of border patrolmen have the forces are just enormous around there, trying to round up migrants, and it's all federal land. There's several federal parks that are really gigantic, and then a bombing range. So there's about a 50-mile north to south run where there's nothing except desert land, and then an extremely treacherous desert land. Today it's 108 degrees in Tucson, and it's probably 10 degrees hotter than that out in Ajo. And there's no homes. There's a single road, and migrants are dying in droves out there. In our case, we had the coroner, the Pima County medical examiner, testify that his office had worked to identify more than 3,000 bodies found along the border over a 20-year period. And anthropologists believe that at least 10 times that many have perished, but the environment has made it impossible to find those bones and find those bodies. So it's a humanitarian crisis of an enormous scale that's going on out there. My client was involved with a group, two different groups, one called No More Deaths and another called Samaritans of Ajo. Both the groups are completely selfless people, composed of completely selfless people whose object is to help people survive in the desert. They're not political in the context of openly supporting particular policies, but they are very focused on trying to prevent deaths, unnecessary deaths that occur in the desert. And to that end, they have several things going on. One is they put water out in the desert, and they don't just put it out willy-nilly. They track precisely where these bodies have been found, and they use GPS tracking to figure out where to put supplies and water, and then go back a week or so later and determine which supplies are actually being used and which are not. So they're extremely methodical. My client, Dr. Warren, was a geographer, PhD in geography. He knew very much what he was doing, but he got charged with 3 misdemeanor charges for basically for littering on federal land, for putting out water supplies and using a 4-wheel drive truck to do so. We ultimately prevailed on those charges, oddly enough, with a defense called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It's an act that's used predominantly, historically has been used predominantly by very, very conservative organizations in order to further their social agenda, to restrict the rights of progressives through the guise of saying, I can't allow that to happen because it offends my religious beliefs. In our case, we convinced the judge, and I think we were all kind of shocked that we convinced the judge, but we convinced the judge in the misdemeanor case to throw out the charges after our trial, because Scott had testified very eloquently that he was acting as a consequence of his conscientious beliefs. He didn't have anything you could call Presbyterianism or Judaism or something that typically is used by RFRA folks. In fact, his father testified that he'd raised him to be a member of the Church of the Great Outdoors. So we were surprised that we won. We should have won, but we did win on that basis. On the felony charges, Scott was charged with harboring, and he was looking at 20 years in prison because he allowed 2 young men from Central America to stay at a way station, is what the government called it. We called it a humanitarian aid station. That is an old building on the outskirts of Ajo, Arizona. And it's used actually as a place to collect pallets of water and prepare to go put them out in the desert along with other supplies. And these 2 young men in their 20s, Christian Perez and Jose Zacaria, showed up at the door, and they had blisters and a cough. This was in January of 2018, I think. Anyway, it was in January, and it was cold. They had flu symptoms and had blisters, and Scott allowed them to stay at this rickety old humanitarian aid station. Not coincidentally, to his arrest, the organization No More Deaths had just on the morning of his arrest had published a report detailing how Border Patrol routinely empties and vandalizes water left out in the desert. And they had several videos of that caught the Border Patrol doing that. They were like wildlife videos that showed that the Border Patrol was doing it. And the videos went viral. So that afternoon, they set up an observation post, and they saw my client, who's quite distinctive and well-known, really tall, beautiful white man, standing outside with 2 brown people. And they put 2 and 2 together and immediately raced in and raided the camp and arrested my client and charged him with harboring. We tried everything in the book, including the international law. Ultimately, I think we filed 127 motions. We really litigated the hell out of it, but ultimately went to trial because we lost all of our motions, which is something I'm accustomed to doing. But we lost all of our motions. We went to trial, and we got a hung jury, which was really a kick in the stomach. We convinced 8 jurors that he was not guilty, but we couldn't convince 4 jurors. And if you don't know it, it's pretty politicized. What's going on the border is really highly politicized, especially in Arizona, which, well, I won't comment too much on Arizona, but Arizona is not an easy place to convince 12 jurors that a person is being a good humanitarian and a good Samaritan simply by doing what Scott Warren did. But we got 8 of them on our side, and then against normal policies, the government decided to prosecute him again. And this time is when we got loaded up even stronger with our jury consultant and a lot of help from the community. And we went to trial, I think, about 6 months later, and we got a not guilty verdict in about, less than 2 hours after a 2-week trial. So they were thoroughly convinced that he was not guilty. And in fact, jurors said at the end of the case, there was quite a large celebration down in the courthouse steps. And there were signs everywhere that said humanitarian aid is not a crime. And a couple of the jurors said humanitarian aid is terrific. So we tried to get those signs to start popping up around Tucson as a consequence. So I'm hoping that there's some questions, and I don't want to take up any more time than I have, but I really, really appreciate you inviting me to talk about this really critical issue.
Great, and thank you, Greg, for your amazing work in Dr. Warren's case and for talking to us a bit about it. So I am going to pose a question to each of the panelists, and I very much encourage the audience to go ahead and post questions, and we will take as many as we have time for. So Obi, I'm going to turn to you first. And in your very interesting and helpful most recent report to the UN Human Rights Council, you do suggest a number, or you make a number of recommendations. So I guess if you could wave a magic wand, what would be the single most useful and realistic action that the council could take in response to this issue?
Okay, thank you. I would suggest that all of them, I'm just kidding, all the recommendations are needed, but I think the one, it's hard to select one, but I think is to make to remove the discretion that states have to define, it's kind of technical, right? The way it's a drafting problem. There's a kind of discretion on states to go back and define humanitarian smuggling generally in their domestic statutes, right? So it needs to be more tightly defined, very explicit. We know that states will do whatever they can. They will twist the language. So we need it to be, I'm not naive. I'm not suggesting you can sort of define it away. However, I think that the tighter and more explicit the definition is, the less room for maneuver they have, the better. I think that's maybe the single most important.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Francis, we've of course been focused on the law, but what non-legal resources could be brought to bear to help move this issue forward? What else do we need to?
Okay, thanks for that, because after being a lawyer for 30 years, I'm now sort of an outlaw, or a heckler. And so actions by civil society are absolutely vital. Even when I was a lawyer, I used to talk about the importance of bringing the community into the courtroom, particularly in an area as political as this is. So if you look at the campaigns, the solidarity campaigns, first of all, for those who were criminalized, like Cedric Heroux, mentioned by Obi, like the Briançon 7, the Ski Patrol people, the Stansted 15. The Stansted 15 were charged with endangering airport security, the sort of terrorist offense in the UK, for stopping a deportation by physically chaining themselves to the plane. So the campaign around that was a big campaign. It hit all the front pages of the papers. It didn't prevent the jury from convicting, but basically the judge told them that more or less they had to convict, because he told them to disregard the defense of human rights which they had presented. So having done that, there was such an outcry that he then did not send them to prison. So he gave them community sentences. So that was very important. Then expanding it a bit, campaigns of civil society, which are incredibly important. So there is the criminalization has led to increasing pushbacks by civil society. So for example, there has been a submission to the International Criminal Court done by civil society organizations accusing the EU and their member states of crimes against humanity for what is called necropolitics of the Mediterranean, that is destroying the boats and criminalizing search and rescue. There was a case to the European, there's cases to the European Court of Human Rights, again taken by civil society actors, on the pullback. So I need just to talk briefly about a campaign that I want everybody to get involved in, possibly. The IMO has designated Libya has designated this massive search and rescue zone as belonging to Libya in the central Mediterranean. It's done that at the insistence of Italy and Malta. It's a complete sham. The Libyan Coast Guard fires on migrant boats. They attack search and rescue vessels, and people who are allegedly rescued by the Libyan Coast Guard are taken back to conditions sometimes of slavery, of torture, in detention centres run by the militias. So the whole registration of this search and rescue zone is a sham designed, it's a filthy deal between Italy, Malta and Libya with the EU's backing, which then takes the responsibility for search and rescue away from the EU. So there is a campaign now, there's an open letter to the IMO, which everybody can sign. And the more international lawyers who sign it, the better. And hopefully the link is going to be posted now. It has to be signed by tomorrow. That's the only problem. Okay, so, but civil society is vital in fighting this hostile environment for migrants, refugees, and those who help them.
Great, thank you so much for those suggestions. And I do think we'll get the link to that petition up in the box very shortly. So please do have a look at it.
Thank you.
Now, Greg, I had a question for you as well, but in fact, it overlaps almost entirely with the great question from one of our audience members. So I'm going to give you that person's version. And our audience member wrote, as an immigrant who has lived on the border and sees these issues firsthand, would love to know your advice to individuals on how to help immigrants and refugees. So what could you tell to people who would like to help?
Well, what carried the day in Scott's case was really the, in my view, was not only a much better jury than the one I picked the first time, but was also a jury instruction that we got in the Ninth Circuit that effectively said that if the actions of the person are not proven beyond a reasonable doubt to have been with criminal intent, then the government had not proved its case. So the important thing to do in terms of assisting migrants is to make it very clear and obvious that your efforts are humanitarian. That would be the biggest piece of advice that I have, other than my standard advice, which is never talk to the cops. It's really important to not talk to whoever arrests you, not give them any information other than your name and birthday and address. But if you allow yourself to be interrogated, then it's going to create more evidence and bad evidence against you. So have the right attitude, that attitude being that you're trying to assist migrants for a humanitarian purpose, and use every right that you've got is my biggest advice.
Great, thank you. So we had a question come in, and I'm going to pose it to you, Obi. It has to do with how can we hold countries accountable who are criminalizing these kind of supportive acts outside of international law? So we do have some protections in international law, and yet countries are criminalizing certain things anyway. How can we hold them accountable?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, in Canada here, there's an important case. The state versus Apollo-Napa. It's in my report actually, the link that you have. It's a great decision where the Supreme Court of Canada basically used the Canadian Constitution, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, to read the human smuggling provision in the Canadian Criminal Code, and to say that to the extent that that provision criminalized or could be read as criminalizing aid to refugees, asylum seekers, or migrants that was done without any sort of material benefit, that it was unconstitutional. Security of the person, basically the kind of implied argument I'm making with international human rights is what they made. But they also read the smuggling protocol and says that the smuggling protocol does not authorize the government's view, which was, remember, this went all the way to the Supreme Court, that they could criminalize persons who helped entry into Canada for no financial or other gain. So in the Cédric Héroux case in France, interestingly, it was the constitutional principle of fraternité, which I found extremely interesting. I don't know if that's going to work in Canada or the US or somewhere else, but this provision in the French constitution about fraternity, which I read, which the court actually, the Constitutional Court of France, read as solidarity, which is a kind of constitutional principle in France. And again, it went all the way to the Constitutional Court, and saying that on that basis, that the state could not then criminalize. If the Constitution requires solidarity, you can't then criminalize solidarity. And that extended to everyone in France. They're both constitutional cases, but slightly different bases. Let me leave it at that.
Right, that is really fascinating and helpful. Thank you for that. So now I'm going to put another question from the audience and ask first Francis and then Greg if he wants to add to it, because it's a really big question. And the question is, how does the treatment of refugees and their supporters differ in Europe versus the US, and what can each learn from the other? So having said all that, we have about 3 minutes left.
Okay, so as Greg was talking about the desert in Arizona, I was thinking about the hostile environment policies in the UK and in these border bottlenecks. So they're very similar in that both in Europe and UK and in the US, the states are seeking to create a hostile environment, or to weaponize a naturally hostile environment, whether it's the Mediterranean Sea or whether it's the Arizona desert, to prevent entry and to make it not worth people's while to come. But people do come because they're desperate, and we know that. So that's a similarity that in both continents, it's the use of force in trying to deal with, as a response to a humanitarian situation. And I think so that's the similarity. I think also that the citizen solidarity movements are similar in both situations. One difference which I picked up on is the issue of harboring. That is not really treated as a crime in the UK. And I'm surprised about the States because of your history of the sanctuary movement, actually. What happened to that, Greg?
Well, they were all convicted.
Oh,
That's the problem.
That's what happened to them, yeah.
I mean, Scott really didn't commit a crime. And that's what we ultimately established, is that humanitarian aid is not a crime. And the government didn't want to accept that. In fact, the U.S. Attorney for Arizona made statements to the press afterwards about, after our acquittal, that he intended to prosecute people if they had these wild, wacky social ideas. I mean, wild, wacky social ideas like Jesus had, is basically what he's talking about. I think one similarity between what's going on in Europe and going on in the United States relative to immigration is the people that are actually on the border and dealing with immigrants on a daily basis, by and large, understand that they have the equivalent of the law of the sea, the duty to rescue. It's the knuckleheads that are in Washington and Iowa and in the middle of the country that don't actually deal with immigrants, that demonize them and don't see them as people, and create these kind of nutty, draconian laws and strategies to penalize people for doing what migrants do. I mean, ultimately what we said is migrants migrate, and they have for thousands of years, and they hopefully will continue to do so for thousands of years more. But that really is, to me, the biggest similarity is the folks that are criminalizing this and demonizing the migrants are not people who look the immigrants as individuals in the eye and deal with them on a routine basis.
Great, thank you both for sharing your thoughts about that last question. So I am being told that our time is coming quickly to a close, so I just want to thank all three of you very much, Obiora Okafor, Francis Weber, and Greg Kirkendall, for the amazing work that you're doing and all of the knowledge and heart that you brought to this panel. And I hope we're all inspired, first quickly to sign Francis's petition, but then to go out and help refugees and asylum seekers. So this closes this panel, and thank you to all in the audience for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Kate.